Lieutenant Sarah Chen's boots pounded against the metal grating as emergency lights strobed through the corridors of Arcturus colony. The evacuation sirens wailed their continuous warning, but she wasn't running toward the escape pods like everyone else. Her destination lay in the opposite direction, the colony's primary defense grid control center. "Chen, what the hell are you doing?" Colonel Martinez's voice crackled through her comm unit. "Last transport leaves in 15 minutes. That's an order." Sarah didn't break stride as she responded. "The defense grid is the only thing keeping those Khazari ships from landing troops directly on top of the evacuation zone. If it fails before the last transport clears atmosphere, no one's getting out alive." The colonel's curse was lost in a burst of static. The Khazari were already jamming their communications. Sarah reached the control center's blast doors, her fingers flying across the keypad. Inside, red warning indicators illuminated nearly every system. The defense grid was failing, just as she'd feared. She dropped to her knees beside the main power coupling, pulling tools from her belt. The problem was obvious. A cascade failure in the electromagnetic shielding had caused the grid's power supply to short out. Fixable, but time-consuming. Sarah glanced at her wrist display. 12 minutes until the last transport departed. The entire facility shuddered as another Khazari bombardment struck the outer shields. Through the viewport, she could see their ships, organic-looking vessels that moved with unsettling synchronization, like a school of predatory fish circling their prey. Come on," Sarah muttered, rerouting power through secondary systems. Her hands were steady despite the stakes. Years of engineering training had taught her that panic was the enemy of precision. Her comm crackled again. "Chen, 5 minutes. Get to the transport now." The defense grid's status indicators began shifting from red to yellow. Almost there. She couldn't leave now. Without the grid, the transport would be shot down before it cleared the atmosphere. Hundreds of lives depended on these next few minutes. Another impact rocked the facility. Sarah's head snapped against the console, and she tasted blood. Ignoring it, she made the final connections. The indicators flickered, then turned green. The defense grid hummed back to life, its protective umbrella strengthening just as another wave of Khazari fire approached. "Defense grid restored," Sarah announced into her comm, already running for the exit. "Beginning evacuation route 2. The blast caught her mid-sentence. A Khazari shot had found a weak point in the outer hull, and the resulting explosion sealed the main corridor to the evacuation zone. Sarah stared at the twisted metal blocking her path, the reality of her situation sinking in with cold certainty. "Colonel," she spoke into her comm, "the main route is blocked. I'll try the maintenance tunnels, but..." She checked her display. 2 minutes. Even if she sprinted, she'd never make it in time. Static was her only answer. The jamming was complete now. Through the viewport, Sarah watched the last transport lift off, its hull gleaming in the light of orbital combat. The defense grid she'd restored held firm, protecting the ship as it climbed higher and higher. Finally, it punched through the upper atmosphere and disappeared among the stars, leaving her alone in an empty colony with an alien army at the gates. Sarah took a deep breath, forcing down her fear. She was an engineer. Engineers solved problems. Right now, she had several. She needed to hide, to survive, and to find a way to contact the fleet. But first, she needed to understand her enemy. The colony's maintenance tunnels would provide cover, at least temporarily. As she retrieved her toolkit and checked her sidearm, Sarah could hear the first Khazari boarding craft attaching to the outer hull. Time to disappear. The war for Arcturus colony was over. But Lieutenant Sarah Chen's war was just beginning. The maintenance tunnel's darkness wrapped around Sarah like a shroud as she watched the Khazari troops through a ventilation grate. 7 days had passed since the evacuation, and she'd spent every moment studying their patterns. What she saw defied everything humans knew about military operations. They moved as one organism. 30 soldiers clearing a room didn't just show good training. They moved with perfect synchronization, each step and gesture mirrored with impossible precision. No human squad, no matter how elite, could achieve that level of coordination. Sarah shifted position, careful not to make a sound. Her datapad recorded everything, its memory filled with observations and theories. The Khazari's chitinous armor made them look like humanoid insects, but their behavior suggested something far more complex than a hive species. A high-pitched whine filled the air as one of Arcturus's infamous magnetic storms approached. Sarah had learned to time her movements with these storms. They interfered with surveillance systems, giving her precious minutes to change positions or scavenge supplies. But this time, something different happened. As the storm intensified, 3 Khazari soldiers near a damaged communications array suddenly stopped moving. Not just paused. They froze completely, like puppets with cut strings. The other soldiers continued their patrol, seemingly unaware of their compromised companions. When the storm passed and the array sputtered back to life, the frozen soldiers resumed their duties as if nothing had happened. Sarah's fingers flew across her datapad. This wasn't the first glitch she'd observed, but it was the most dramatic. The pattern was becoming clear. Every anomaly in Khazari behavior corresponded with communications disruptions. "They're not coordinating," she whispered to herself. "They're connected." The pieces clicked together. The perfect synchronization, the complete lack of verbal commands, the way isolated units became non-responsive. It wasn't just a command structure, it was a neural network. The Khazari weren't individual soldiers following orders, they were appendages of a single consciousness. Sarah pulled up the colony's architectural plans on her datapad. She'd mapped the locations of every communications array the Khazari had installed since their arrival. The pattern looked familiar, because it mimicked organic neural pathways. Each array wasn't just a repeater, it was a synapse in an artificial nervous system stretched across the colony. A warning indicator flashed on her datapad. Battery at 15%. Sarah had been rationing power, but she needed to understand this. She pulled up footage she'd recorded of Khazari casualties. Their doctors never tried to save injured soldiers. They simply disconnected them from the network and discarded them. Without the hive mind connection, a Khazari wasn't even considered alive. It was their greatest strength, and potentially, their greatest weakness. The Khazari had evolved beyond individual thought. They had no concept of independent action, no contingency for isolation. Each soldier was as dependent on the network as a human neuron was on the brain. A squad of Khazari passed beneath her hiding spot. Sarah held her breath, though she'd learned they rarely looked up. Their sensors swept for specific threats: weapons, explosives, active electronics. They weren't looking for a lone human with a powered-down datapad, because their unified consciousness couldn't conceive of a threat so small. That was their second weakness. Perfect coordination meant predictable responses. The hive mind could direct thousands of bodies with incredible efficiency, but it always followed the same patterns. It couldn't improvise, couldn't adapt to scenarios it hadn't encountered before. Sarah's datapad dimmed as battery power dropped further, but she'd seen enough. The Khazari weren't invaders. They were invasion. A single entity wearing thousands of bodies like armor. But like any nervous system, it could be overloaded, confused, severed. She allowed herself a small smile as she powered down the datapad. The Khazari thought they'd captured an empty colony. Instead, they'd given a human engineer 7 days to study their entire nervous system. Now it was time to introduce them to a uniquely human concept: sabotage. Sarah stood before the colony's atmospheric control panel, her fingers hovering over the controls as she double-checked her calculations. After 3 weeks of hiding, planning, and studying Khazari patterns, she was ready to test her theory. The plan wasn't just about disrupting communications. It was about making the disruption appear natural. "Let's see how you handle a little weathered," she muttered, initiating the sequence she'd programmed. The colony's atmospheric processors had been designed to protect against Arcturus's magnetic storms. Sarah had reversed their function, using them to amplify the natural phenomena instead. Within minutes, localized magnetic disturbances began building around 3 carefully chosen communication nodes. Through her makeshift periscope, fashioned from salvaged optical cables and mirror fragments, she watched the first signs of her success. A patrol of 6 Khazari soldiers approached the affected area. As they entered the magnetic field, their movements became erratic. 2 stopped entirely, while the others began moving in conflicting directions, like a glitching video game. Sarah held her breath, waiting for the hive mind's response. This was the crucial moment. If the Khazari recognized this as an attack, all her planning would be wasted. But she'd chosen her targets carefully. These particular nodes had shown sensitivity to natural magnetic interference before. The response came exactly as she predicted. Khazari engineers arrived to strengthen the node's shielding, treating it as a natural phenomenon. They didn't even search the area. Why would they? Their unified consciousness couldn't conceive of a single human deliberately creating localized magnetic storms. Sarah allowed herself a small fist pump before moving to Phase 2. As the engineers worked to protect the first set of nodes, she triggered another atmospheric sequence on the opposite side of the colony. The beauty of her plan wasn't just the disruption, it was the cascade effect. Each solution the Khazari implemented would make them more vulnerable to her next attack. The problem with perfect coordination, she whispered, watching more Khazari units fall into disarray, is that it breaks perfectly too. The hive mind's reactions became increasingly confused. Some units received contradictory information as signals bounced through damaged nodes. Others experienced delayed responses, creating gaps in the Khazari's usually flawless coordination. Sarah witnessed 2 patrols collide in a corridor, their perfect synchronization shattered by conflicting neural inputs. But the true victory came when she intercepted their diagnostic protocols. The Khazari weren't just failing to identify the cause. They were actively misdiagnosing it. Each engineering team proposed a different solution. All of them focused on strengthening their network against natural interference. They were rebuilding their nervous system to be more sensitive, not less. A warning klaxon suddenly blared through the colony. Sarah's heart jumped until she realized it wasn't an intruder alert. It was an environmental warning. Her atmospheric manipulations had triggered the colony's automated safety systems. The Khazari would have to respond to that too, spreading their attention even thinner. She allowed the chaos to build for precisely 12 minutes before slowly returning the atmospheric conditions to normal. Long enough to cause disruption, not long enough to establish a pattern. The Khazari engineers would spend days trying to solve a problem that no longer existed, making them less prepared for her next strike. Sarah retrieved her datapad from its shielded case and added new observations to her growing database. The hive mind's responses were becoming predictable. Identify disruption, analyze pattern, implement counters. But it always assumed natural causes because artificial ones required imagination, required individual thought. She was teaching them something they'd never experienced before: doubt. Every failure to solve these natural problems created microfractures in their perfect certainty. The hive mind was learning to distrust its own senses, and it had no psychological framework for handling that distrust. Sarah packed up her equipment, already planning her next attack. The Khazari had turned this colony into their nervous system. Time to give them a few nervous breakdowns. Sarah's hands moved across the salvaged Khazari interface panel, her fingers dancing over alien symbols that had become familiar over the past month. She positioned herself in a maintenance shaft, directly above one of their primary diagnostic centers, where she could tap into their network without being detected. The real trick wasn't accessing their systems. It was making her intrusions look like routine maintenance data. "Let's see how you handle this," she whispered, injecting the carefully crafted repair log into their system. The log detailed a series of phantom power fluctuations in Sector 7, complete with false sensor readings she'd spent days fabricating. It would send their engineers exactly where she needed them, away from the actual vulnerabilities she discovered in Sector 4. Through her observation port, she watched 3 Khazari technicians process the new information. Their movements were still perfectly synchronized, but she'd learned to spot the subtle signs of confusion in their behavior, the slight pause before executing a command, the redundant checking of data points. The hive mind was learning to distrust its own systems, and that distrust was creating microscopic delays in its decision-making. A warning flashed on her jury-rigged scanner. Significant neural activity approaching. Sarah held her breath as a Khazari overseer entered the diagnostic center. She'd learned to identify their specialized castes. Overseers had enhanced neural interfaces, allowing them to process more complex data streams. This one was examining her false repair logs. For a tense moment, Sarah's hand hovered over her emergency trigger, a localized electromagnetic pulse that would cover her escape if needed. But the overseer's reaction proved her strategy was working. Instead of questioning the log's authenticity, it began allocating additional resources to investigate the phantom problems she created. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The hive mind's greatest weakness wasn't its centralized nature. It was its inability to conceive of deception. Every false reading she planted was accepted as truth, because the concept of deliberately false data was alien to their consciousness. She began the next phase of her plan, carefully introducing subtle corruptions into their diagnostic protocols. Not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to ensure that every repair attempt would actually weaken their network stability. The hive mind was about to learn another very human concept, the cascade failure. A burst of static through her headphones made her wince. The Khazari were broadcasting new repair protocols through their network. Sarah quickly began recording the transmission, adding to her growing library of their technical language. Each burst of data helped her understand more of their technology, their protocols, and most importantly, their limitations. The overseer suddenly shifted position, its sensor arrays pointing directly at her hiding spot. Sarah froze. Had she been detected? Then she realized. It wasn't looking for her. The hive mind was implementing new scanning protocols, systematically searching for the source of its system instabilities. She was witnessing evolution in action. The collective consciousness was developing primitive paranoia. She carefully began disconnecting her equipment. She pushed far enough for one session. As she packed up, she took one last look at her handiwork through the observation port. The diagnostic center was now crowded with Khazari engineers, all simultaneously processing different false alarms and maintenance requests she'd seeded throughout their network. "The problem with having one mind," she whispered, "is that you can only think one thought at a time." Sarah began her careful journey back through the maintenance tunnels, already planning her next infiltration. Her false data was causing the hive mind to second-guess its own sensory inputs. Soon, she'd have them chasing shadows across every sector of the colony. The irony wasn't lost on her. The Khazari had created a perfect system of unified consciousness, only to have it undermined by one of humanity's most imperfect traits, the ability to lie. Sometimes, she reflected, the greatest advantage wasn't having a perfect system. It was understanding how to break one. The colony's long-range communication array loomed before Sarah, its twisted spires now covered in Khazari biological interfaces. After 6 weeks of guerrilla warfare against the hive mind, this would be her riskiest operation yet. One mistake, one misaligned signal, and she'd reveal her presence to the entire collective consciousness. Sarah unpacked her hybrid transmitter, a grotesque marriage of human and Khazari technology. She built it from scavenged parts, colonial transmission arrays, salvaged neural interfaces, and components she'd quietly stolen during her sabotage campaigns. It looked wrong, like something assembled in a fever dream, but its very wrongness was its strength. The hive mind would never anticipate a device that shouldn't exist. "Time to phone home," she muttered, connecting her datapad to the hybrid transmitter. The real challenge wasn't sending the message, it was hiding it within the Khazari's own communications traffic. She'd spent weeks studying their transmission patterns, learning the rhythm of their neural exchanges. Her fingers flew across the interface as she began the complex process of initialization. The hybrid device powered up with an unsettling hum, its mismatched components struggling to work together. Sarah checked her chronometer. She had exactly 18 minutes before the next Kizari patrol would pass below her position. The first data packet went out, disguised as routine network maintenance. Sarah held her breath, watching the hive mind's response. Nothing. No alarm, no sudden shift in patrol patterns. The biological interfaces pulsed with their usual rhythm, unknowingly passing her Trojan horse through their neural network. She began uploading her complete analysis of Kizari vulnerabilities. 6 weeks of observations, technical specifications, and strategic weaknesses, all compressed into a tight beam transmission. The hybrid transmitter grew hot as it worked to encode the massive data stream into segments small enough to hide within normal network traffic. Suddenly, a surge of neural activity rippled through the nearby interfaces. Sarah's hands froze over her controls. Had they detected her? No. It was a standard network diagnostic, but it was processing more data than usual. The hive mind was becoming more thorough in its system checks, learning from the chaos she'd been causing. A warning light flashed on her datapad. The power draw from her transmitter was becoming noticeable. She needed to finish the transmission before the hive mind's improved diagnostics identified the anomaly. Sarah redirected power through secondary systems, trying to mask the signature. 14 minutes until the patrol. The upload was only halfway complete. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. She could abort now, try again another day. But the hive mind was adapting, growing more suspicious. Every day she waited meant a higher chance of detection. A new alert. Power fluctuations in a nearby sector. The hive mind was tracking the energy drain, working to identify its source. Sarah grabbed her neural probe and quickly inserted false readings into the local sensors. Just a few more minutes. A hybrid transmitter's casing began to crack, alien and human components fighting against each other as they pushed beyond their limits. Sarah's fingers danced across her controls, trying to hold the device together through its final transmission bursts. 3 minutes until the patrol. The upload reached 97%. New alerts flashed across her datapad. The hive mind was definitely aware that something was wrong. Security protocols activated across the network. She could feel the collective consciousness shifting its attention toward her sector. The transmitter gave a final, tortured whine as the upload completed. Sarah quickly initiated her disconnect sequence, but she knew it was too late. The power surge had been too obvious, too anomalous. The hive mind was fully alert now, and it had finally identified an impossible truth. It was not alone in the colony. As she hurriedly packed her equipment, Sarah allowed herself a grim smile. The human fleet now had everything they needed to understand the Kizari's weaknesses. Her part was done. Now she just had to survive long enough for them to use it. The hunt was about to begin. Sarah sprinted through the maintenance tunnel, no longer worried about stealth. The hive mind knew she existed now, and it was committing its full attention to finding her. The sound of Kizari hunter-seekers echoed through the ventilation system. Biomechanical drones designed specifically for pursuit through confined spaces. She reached a junction and paused, listening. The hunters were approaching from multiple directions, their movements coordinated with inhuman precision. But Sarah had spent weeks studying that coordination, learning its patterns. More importantly, she learned how to break them. "Let's see how well you hunt when you can't trust your own senses," she whispered, pulling out her latest creation, a neural disruptor cobbled together from damaged Kizari components. She activated it and tossed it down the left tunnel, then took the right passage. The device activated, flooding the local network with contradictory sensory data. Through her datapad, she watched the hunter-seekers' reactions. Half of them froze, caught between conflicting commands. The others began moving in random patterns, their perfect coordination shattered by the confusion flooding their neural network. But the hive mind was learning. A new signal pulsed through the network, and the hunters began adapting, filtering out the false data. Sarah had expected this. It's why she prepared multiple strategies. She reached another junction and pulled out a small canister. The Kizari relied heavily on biochemical sensors. Sarah had spent days synthesizing a compound that matched her own biochemical signature, using samples from her old quarters. She opened the canister, letting the compound leak into the ventilation system. Within minutes, her trail would lead in dozens of directions. A hunter-seeker burst through a vent ahead of her. Sarah dropped and rolled, barely avoiding its grabbing appendages. She came up running, heading for the colony's water reclamation system. The hunter followed, its movements precise and deadly. But Sarah wasn't trying to outrun it. She was counting on its pursuit. She reached the water processing chamber and vaulted over a railing, landing on a maintenance platform. The hunter-seeker followed, exactly as she'd predicted. The moment it crossed the threshold, Sarah activated her override sequence. The chamber's purification protocols engage, flooding the area with electromagnetic pulses designed to destroy microorganisms. The hunter-seeker convulsed as the pulses disrupted its neural connection. But Sarah wasn't finished. She'd modified the pulse pattern to resonate through the neural network, creating feedback that would disorient every connected unit in the sector. Through her datapad, she watched the chaos spread. Hunter-seekers crashed into walls, their coordination completely disrupted. Regular Khazari troops stumbled, their unified consciousness temporarily fragmented by the feedback. But the hive mind was evolving faster than she'd anticipated. New hunter-seekers arrived, these ones shielded against electromagnetic interference. They moved differently too, less synchronized but more unpredictable. The collective consciousness was learning to sacrifice perfect coordination for adaptability. Sarah was already moving, heading for her next prepared zone. She'd spent weeks setting up these fallback positions, each designed to exploit a different weakness in the hive mind's architecture. But she could feel the pressure mounting. Each trick worked less effectively than the last as the Khazari adapted. A sudden surge of neural activity made her freeze. The hive mind was implementing a new strategy. Instead of trying to predict her movements, it was sealing off sections of the colony, systematically reducing her maneuvering space. It was learning to think strategically, not just tactically. Sarah checked her datapad's map, noting the shrinking safe zones. She had maybe hours before they closed off all her escape routes. But she smiled despite the danger. Every adaptation, every new strategy the hive mind developed required it to think more independently, less collectively. In trying to catch her, they were becoming more human. She headed deeper into the colony's infrastructure, already planning her next move. The hunt was becoming a mutual education. She was learning to think like them, and they were learning to think like her. The question was, which side would learn faster? Sarah saw the flashes of orbital combat before the Khazari alarm systems activated. Through a viewport in her current hiding spot, a maintenance crawl space in the colony's upper levels, she watched human warships emerge from FTL travel, their arrival precisely coordinated to coincide with Arcturus's strongest magnetic storm cycle. "They got my message," she whispered, allowing herself the first real smile in weeks. The human fleet's formation wasn't their standard attack pattern. They were positioning themselves to target the specific weaknesses she'd identified in Khazari neural network architecture. The hive mind's reaction was immediate and massive. Every Khazari in the colony suddenly moved with renewed purpose, all thoughts of hunting her temporarily forgotten as they responded to this larger threat. Sarah used their distraction to reach her final prepared position, a makeshift command center she'd assembled inside a damaged atmospheric processor. Her hybrid transmitter hummed to life one last time. She'd saved her most devastating codes for this moment, waiting until the hive mind was fully committed to orbital defense. As human ships engaged the Khazari fleet, Sarah began her broadcast. The first wave of her attack hit the colony's primary communication nodes, not to destroy them. She'd learned that brutal force wasn't the answer. Instead, she introduced subtle errors into their neural protocols, desynchronizing their response times by microseconds. To the hive mind, it felt like thoughts arriving out of order, creating cognitive dissonance on a massive scale. Through her cobbled-together surveillance system, she watched the effects cascade through the Khazari ranks. Ground troops responded to threats seconds before they appeared. Gun batteries targeted phantom ships. The hive mind's perfect coordination became its perfect confusion. A massive explosion rocked the colony. Sarah checked her displays. Human special forces had breached the outer hull, targeting exactly the weak points she'd identified. But the Khazari response was wrong, too slow, too rigid. Their defensive protocols couldn't adapt to enemies who knew exactly how they would react. Time for the final, Sarah muttered, initiating her last program. She'd spent weeks mapping the hive mind's cognitive architecture, learning how it processed and distributed information. Now she introduced a virus that spoke its own language, not attacking, but questioning. Every order the hive mind sent was met with requests for confirmation, creating feedback loops of uncertainty. The effect was devastating. The hive mind, faced with its first experience of self-doubt, began second-guessing every decision. Khazari ships fired on their own units, unable to trust their target identification. Ground forces moved in contradictory patterns, each subset of the collective consciousness trying to verify its orders through increasingly fragmented neural pathways. Sarah's datapad lit up with new signals. Human strike teams had reached the colony's main communication hubs. They were implementing the protocols she'd developed, not destroying the Khazari network, but corrupting it, turning its own strength against itself. A sudden surge of neural activity made her heart stop. The hive mind had finally detected her location. Hunter-seekers converged on her position, moving with desperate speed. But their movements were clumsy now, degraded by the confusion flooding their network. Sarah activated her final defensive measures. Not to fight, but to broadcast. She transmitted everything she could see, everything she could detect about the hive mind's deteriorating cognitive state, directly to the human fleet. Every failure, every contradiction, every moment of confusion became tactical data for the attacking forces. The colony shuddered as more human troops breached its defenses. The Khazari, their perfect unity shattered by cascading doubts and contradictions, couldn't mount an effective defense. Their reactions became increasingly erratic as the hive mind tried desperately to reassert control over its fragmented consciousness. Sarah watched through her monitors as the impossible happened. Khazari units began acting independently, their neural connections too corrupted to maintain collective control. The hive mind's greatest strength had become its greatest vulnerability, and she had taught it the true meaning of chaos. The battle for Arcturus colony was about to end, but its impact on the war was just beginning. Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood in Arcturus colony's central control room, watching the last Khazari ships retreat from the system. Their once perfect formation was shattered, each vessel moving independently as their neural network continued to fragment. 7 weeks of hiding, planning, and sabotage had culminated in this moment. Not just a victory, but a fundamental change in how the war would be fought. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez approached, looking both impressed and slightly uncomfortable. The Fleet Admiralty is requesting a full briefing on your methods. Apparently, similar tactics are already proving successful across 3 other Khazari-held systems. Sarah nodded, her attention still on the tactical display. The retreating Khazari weren't just defeated, they were changed. Their movements showed signs of individual decision-making, something that should have been impossible for their species. They're adapting, she said, but not in the way they intended. The control room buzzed with activity as human technicians worked to restore the colony systems. They'd found Sarah's hybrid technologies throughout the facility, jerry-rigged combinations of human and Khazari tech that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. Several engineers were already documenting her innovations for research and development. The hive mind's trying to isolate the affected units, Sarah explained, pointing to patterns in the retreat. But it can't. I didn't just corrupt their network. I taught them to think independently. They can't unlearn that, any more than we could unlearn how to think for ourselves. A junior officer rushed up with a data tablet. Sir, ma'am, we're getting reports from the frontier. The Khazari are withdrawing from multiple systems, not just Arcturus. Their entire command structure seems to be fracturing. Sarah wasn't surprised. The hive mind's greatest strength had been its absolute unity, its ability to coordinate vast forces with perfect precision. But she introduced something they'd never evolved to handle: doubt. Like a virus spreading through their neural network, the concept of independent thought was infecting their entire civilization. "They'll try to adapt," she said, watching the tactical display update with new withdrawal reports. "They'll attempt to compartmentalize their network, create firewalls between units. But it won't work. They've experienced individual consciousness now. You can't put that genie back in the bottle." Colonel Martinez shook his head in amazement. "When we lost Arcturus, everyone thought it was a strategic disaster. Instead, it gave us the key to winning the war. One engineer left behind." He trailed off, still processing the implications. "It wasn't about fighting them," Sarah explained, finally turning away from the display. "It was about understanding them. The hive mind wasn't just their strength, it was their identity. They'd evolved beyond individual thought, becoming something greater but also more vulnerable. All I did was remind them of what they'd lost." The tactical display showed more retreats, more fragmenting formations. The Khazari weren't just withdrawing. They were experiencing an existential crisis. Every unit that had been exposed to Sarah's cognitive virus was spreading confusion through the hive mind, creating a cascade of philosophical doubt that their unified consciousness couldn't process. "The war's not over," Sarah cautioned, seeing the celebrations beginning around her. "But it's change. The Khazari will either have to evolve to embrace individual thought, or retreat to isolate themselves from its influence. Either way, they'll never be the same." She picked up her battered datapad, still containing her observations and analyses from 7 weeks of guerrilla warfare against an alien consciousness. Its contents would be studied in military academies for generations, not just for its tactical insights, but for its implications about consciousness, free will, and the nature of intelligence itself. "Sometimes," she said, looking out at the stars where the Khazari ships had vanished, "the strongest weapon isn't the ability to destroy, it's the ability to change, to adapt, to think differently." She smiled slightly. "We just taught an entire civilization how to doubt. Everything else is just details." The victory at Arcturus Colony marked more than just a turning point in the war. It marked the moment when humanity's greatest weakness, their messy, contradictory, individual consciousness, proved to be their greatest strength.